Hello, this is the final instalment in this short series of lectures, seminars around introducing pagan theology and ideas related to an understanding of the various pagan religions and their views of the cosmos. For this third and the final one, we're going to get on to talking about notions of suffering and of evil and goodness, wickedness, cruelty, however you wish to use that term. Various interchangeable words you could use there, and to talk in terms of talking about goodness, to understand how a number of different pagan traditions have understood ethics, morality, what are considered to be appropriate ethical codes to live by. And of course, by contrast, you could say that evil or dishonour or whatever phrases you want to use characterise the failure to live by those standards, by those values. A concept we introduced in the second of this set of three seminars was Theodicy. Theodicy comes from Theostike, the justice of God, or the gods. Theodike would be the justice of gods. It's a concept that primarily came to the fore under Christianity and then later under Islam. And there are arguments around theodicy in Judaism, and although it started as a primarily monotheist argument, it can exist as easily in polytheist paganism, pantheist paganism, secular paganism, etc., and non-pagan religions that would fit those theological descriptions. Chiefly the reason why it developed within Christianity is because Christianity, pretty much since the day it started, has argued that God is the supreme being in the universe, all-knowing, all-powerful, and, critically, all-benevolent, all-good, a being composed entirely of goodness and good intentions and the wish for goodness. Now, clearly, as any human being on the planet can tell you from their own lived experience, life consists of a great deal of suffering. Suffering of the body, aches and pains and injuries and diseases, the suffering of the mind through fear and dread and worry and torment and so on. There's a lot of suffering in the world. Now, if God is all good and therefore a just being, justice and goodness normally being seen as two ideas that go hand in glove, then how do we reconcile a being that is very benevolent with the existence of suffering? And this is something that Christianity has dealt with in various approaches and capacities. So you get arguments, for example, John Hicks put forward, the Christian theologian, the notion that suffering is good for the soul, it strengthens the soul. And a not unpopular image to use in this context is that of the blacksmith plunging the sword he's making, or indeed she's making, into red-hot coals and then into buckets of ice-cold water, going from extremes of heat to extremes of cold to make the metal tougher and stronger and make the sword a better sword. And so extremes of suffering can be viewed as ways of toughening up the soul for things that are yet to come. Other people have argued that, a common Islamic argument, for example, is that all suffering is ultimately just. So even if you, as a mere human being, a mere mortal, cannot see the reason why suffering occurs, nonetheless there will be a reason, an appropriate reason for why you or the person whose life you're looking at is experiencing suffering. There's always justice there. It's just that human beings often struggle to see what that justice is, largely because we see the small picture and not the vast cosmic picture. People in the ancient world also thought to themselves, why do awful things happen? And they came up with their own conclusions, some of which we'll look at as we go on. I say some because obviously we're talking vast swathes of history with enormously large numbers of thinkers and philosophers, and this is only meant to be an introduction. So this is just a smattering of ideas to consider. On top of notions of suffering, we also have to factor in notions of moral evil. Now, suffering in the context of events like earthquakes and volcanoes and so forth has traditionally been classified by theologians, when they're talking about theodicy, as natural evil. If you don't much like the term evil, you could substitute natural suffering. In other words, shit happens, bad stuff happens, and we understand that a lot of that bad stuff does not appear to be caused by any individual person. So when an earthquake happens, there is no particular person you can blame for the earthquake necessarily, although throughout history people have had a good go at finding someone to blame for earthquakes. Human agency can be a factor in disease, living in unsanitary conditions or engaging in behaviours that might well cause a disease in your own body or in somebody else's body. But by and large, disease is something that happens to us rather than a factor of our own causation, our own choice. And it's sometimes speculated that even if a particular human, no mortal agency can be blamed for these sufferings, a number of cultures said, well, perhaps there is a divine agency behind them. So the ancient Greeks often felt that Poseidon was at the root of earthquakes and tidal waves, that when these great events happened, maybe this was one or other of the gods expressing their displeasure. Possibly that displeasure may have been at things that human beings had done. So inadvertently there was a human at the root of it, or a group of humans at the root of it, but in a very indirect sort of a way. Of more, perhaps, interest to a lot of philosophers and thinkers is the realm of moral evil. That is to say, vile acts engaged in quite deliberately, quite maliciously by human beings. Potentially by others as well, because going back to last week's seminar when we were talking about the multitude of sapient beings out there other than humans, we may not be the only species to engage in vile activities. I'm not going to get into some weird moral attempt to argue that cats or horses or elephants or sharks or something engage in moral wickedness. Well, possibly they might, who knows, but it's nigh on impossible to tell from a human perspective. But there could well be other beings of, shall we say, higher up the intellectual chain, capable of greater levels of reason and thought and so forth, who are just as capable of doing vile things as human beings are. And so we can add not only to this list of things you've got on the screen, rape and torture and robbery and so on, you could probably sit there and add a dozen or more acts and deeds onto that list of vile things that people do, knowing perfectly well that what they are doing is wrong. It gets a little more uncertain or ambiguous when the people engaging in these activities may not necessarily have the capacity to fully understand what they're doing. Therefore, is it evil in quite the same way as when somebody is possessed of their full functioning faculties and they still do these things anyway? Something we'll reflect on as we go along. And a lot of religions not only have attempted to account for, well, I say pretty much all religions really, have attempted to account for suffering in the sense of why do we get diseases, why has my house been flattened in an earthquake, why has a volcano wiped out my entire family, but also to account for how moral evil exists in the world. Why are people capable of choosing to torture one another, or to murder one another, or to molest one another? Where does the urge to do that sort of thing come from in the first place? And is it just people? Because obviously in a number of religions and traditions you have ideas of demons and giants and malicious entities that will also do these sorts of activities. So again, it's not always only human beings, but whoever it is, whatever it is, why do they start doing these behaviours in the first place? Why do we have the capacity, the urge, the impulse to do that? So different religions have tried to account for the root of human and non-human maliciousness. And we'll think of some of the ideas as we go along. It's not uncommon in modern day paganism to find people who will refute the idea of there being malice, evil, wickedness, whatever word you want to call it, and say, well, perhaps as Aristotle in ancient Greece argued that people who do awful things do so because they are ignorant, because they don't know any better. And that if they did know better, they wouldn't do them. Therefore, ignorance is the key driver, the root of all wickedness. And other people will go more down the moral relativism argument, epitomised by Baruch Spinoza, of saying there isn't really any such thing as good and evil. It's simply the way a society arbitrarily describes certain behaviours. And so it's a cultural notion rather than something with an objective reality. All of which can be true to a point, but I think when we're confronted with individuals like the three on the screen here, at that juncture, these arguments become childish. They become paltry. So just in case anyone is unfamiliar with the faces, Ilse Koch was a Nazi concentration camp guard responsible for a vast number of murders. On her own account, she would strangle children with her own hair. She would push them into the sewage ditches in the concentration camp and laugh while she watched them drown in raw sewage. She engaged in all sorts of brutalities above and beyond anything which, being a bog standard camp guard, would have necessitated. She took immense pleasure in killing in the most horrible, sadistic, brutal fashion going. The central picture is Joseph Fritzl, who kept his own daughter hostage in a secret chamber that he had built expressly for the purpose underneath his house for about 24 years, I think it was, where he raped her again and again and again, probably 1,000 times over during the course of her entrapment. When this all came to light in a court case, it turned out that he'd started abusing her when she was about 11, and then had eventually, when she was an adult, tricked her into entering this secret chamber underneath the house and locked her in there for 24 odd years, and had fathered 7 children with his own daughter. Killed one of them, raised 3 as his own, kept the other 3, and so I don't think he may have molested them too. I don't know if he turned upon his sort of grandchildren / children, or however you want to describe that level of inbreeding, but engaged in certainly very brutal violence against them. Whether or not he also molested them, I don't know. But definitely brutal violence, torment, and a level of wickedness that is difficult to comprehend. And at the time of speaking is still alive in a prison cell in Austria. Hopefully he will not be there for very much longer, that dreadful man. The couple in the photograph are Fred and Rose West, who also engaged in incest, both of them, molesting their own children, raping and murdering various women that some of whom worked for them as au pairs, and some of whom they snatched off the street. Brutal levels of torture, sadism, cruelty, prolonged repeated rape, acts that just don't even bear thinking about the level of cruelty involved, before finally they were caught. Fred West hanged himself in prison, and his wife Rose West is still alive and still in prison, at least at the time of this recording, and according to a number of prison officers is still as dreadful a person now as she was at the start. This level of barbarity goes beyond notions of moral relativism. It's repugnant in any society around the world. There may be blips in history, like the Nazi regime, which tolerate such behaviours or indeed actively encourage them for a short period of time, so long as they are targeted at specific types of victims, whose lives are obviously not held in any esteem or value. But in the vast majority of societies, this behaviour is beyond the pale, it's beyond any measure of acceptability. And the urge to engage in such behaviours, to lock your own daughter in a basement for 24 years and rape her 1,000 times over, is beyond comprehension. And so these are the very, very, very extreme cases, and obviously there's an awful lot more kind of small scale, shall we say, acts of viciousness, spite, cruelty, just nastiness, that we're more likely to encounter the small scale stuff, thankfully, than we're ever likely to encounter the extremes of the sorts of behaviours engaged in by the people on the screen. But how do we account for that? Psychologists have tied themselves in knots trying to account for such behaviour. Sociologists puff a lot of hot air but fail to come up with any truly meaningful account of why such behaviours take place. I'm not sure religion fares an awful lot better, any of the religions of the world fare an awful lot better at trying to explain such extremes. But they try. And we'll look at some of the ideas around these kinds of moral evils, to why you get such extreme forms of behaviour, and also the more smaller scale forms of awfulness, why they exist too. We'll have a think about as we go along. So whether or not you like the word evil, you can call it something else, you can call it wickedness or any other word you fancy, but behaviour of this very extreme nature. We'll try to look at the accounts given of it from a pagan point of view. So first off, to put into context that there are four main philosophical schools of thought, and you can encounter these not only in paganism, you can encounter them amongst atheist schools of thought, amongst the monotheist religions of the world, all sorts of approaches. So these are not peculiar to paganism by any stretch of the imagination. Moral absolutism is an approach found in Christianity and Islam, Judaism, that there are certain behaviours which are always good and certain behaviours which are always wicked, and that the measure of goodness and evil is set by deity, is set by the divine. So it's an argument put forward, for example, by Thomas Aquinas, that there are definite things that are always good and always evil, and it doesn't matter what an individual society says. So if you happen to have been born into a society where cannibalism is a routine practice, even if it's quite commonplace and acceptable in that society, if cannibalism is forbidden by God, then it's wicked, whether you know it's wicked or not. And so there is a price to pay for it accordingly. Clearly, it becomes an even worse matter if you do know it's wicked and you still do it. If you've got no idea, you don't know any better, because that's the way you've been raised, then you could argue there is a bit of a moral sort of, not a get-out clause, but the person who does not know any better is maybe less wicked than the person who does know better, but does it anyway. Amoralism is a stance argued by Friedrich Nietzsche, who was certainly interested in ancient pagan beliefs, even if he wasn't a practitioner of them. Amoralism is his idea that in nature there is no such thing as good or evil. Behaviour is what it is. There are survival behaviours, and maybe some behaviours do help towards survival, and some behaviours significantly undermine survival, perhaps. So you could think in terms of what is or is not helpful towards the survival of a given species, but per se there is no good, there is no evil. It's the relative experience of the individual, which does tip over a little bit into the third category on the screen. But put it in a context. If I really like rabbits, for argument's sake, and I see a rabbit being menaced by a fox, I might rescue the rabbit from being eaten by the fox, and the rabbit might think I'm a very kindly, benevolent soul for doing so, for saving its life. The fox, on the other hand, will not be quite so impressed, and if the fox starves to death as a result of my denying it food, in trying to do good for the rabbit, I've done evil for the fox, if you're going to use terms like good and evil in the first place. What is of benefit to the rabbit is of disadvantage to the fox, and of course vice versa. So if I really liked foxes and I fed a rabbit to the fox would be perhaps very appreciative of the act, but the rabbit and the rabbit's family might consider me the biggest monster going for having fed this poor little rabbit to the fox. What's good for one is not good for another, and a lot of actions in human life and the world in general can be understood that just as there are different species and different factions within humanity, what's good for one nation or one section of society may not be very good for another. And coming up with an activity that's absolutely good for everyone, that has no negative effect on anybody at all, is a challenge, to put it mildly, if not nigh on impossible at times. And so when we understand notions of people talking about good and evil, Nietzsche might counter and say, well, that behaviour is good for you, or that other behaviour is bad for you, but it might have the opposite effect on somebody else's life. And so it's down to kind of an individual standpoint. So nature itself has no objective sense of right and wrong, good and evil. Things happen not for any moral reason or with any great moral context. Spinoza's approach of moral relativism was to look not so much at earthquakes and famines and tidal waves, but at different cultural notions of good and bad in different societies and different points of history. So it may be the case that in the 16th century, two men having sex together was condemned as wicked and sinful and awful. At least it was in 16th century Britain, but maybe if we went back to 1st century Athens, then it would have been perfectly humdrum. Not particularly good, not particularly bad, it was just a relationship, no different really from any other relationship. And it would not have been considered a wicked thing in and of itself. So what is wicked in one society is neutral in another society, and of course in some societies might be seen as an active good, as something definitely worth striving for. So it depends where you are in history and where you are in the world as to whether any given behaviour is likely to be seen as good or bad. There are some behaviours which I think you would struggle to find any society regarding as definitely good. Some behaviours seem to be held as wicked in the vast majority of societies. Which is a point of thought, perhaps, to consider why that should be so. And maybe that slides more towards a touch of moral absolutism. But Spinoza's point being that you can only understand what's good or bad for you and for the society you live in as being a kind of a temporal historical manifestation rather than a permanent state of affairs that is divinely approved of. Moral universalism, which is an idea from the ancient world, Aristotle as an example is somebody who thought about moral universalism, integrates some of the ideas of moral relativism going back a long time before Spinoza himself was born. There is certainly a degree of sort of flexibility in that, yes, society's periods of history chop and change as to quite what is appropriate, quite what isn't appropriate at any given moment in time. However, Aristotle said that there are certain things that almost all societies consider good and certain things that almost all societies consider bad. So loyalty to your own family is praised in pretty much all societies, whereas having sex with 5-year-olds is condemned in almost all societies. There may be the odd society here or there which disagrees on those matters, but 99% of societies would concur that certain things are definitely good and certain things are definitely bad. And so for Aristotle, those consistent patterns of good and bad are ones which give humanity a sense that whilst there may be individual preferences, that should you marry one person in a monogamous relationship or should you be polygamous and have 4 wives or 5 husbands or what have you, that may vary from culture to culture. But there are other key issues which crop up again and again and again. Almost everywhere objects to cannibalism. There are exceptions to that, but almost every society objects to cannibalism. Therefore, Aristotle might well take it that there is a universal wickedness in cannibalism and a universal goodness in nurturing and supporting your family, because that's what most societies think. So we can understand morality in these four main contexts. If we're thinking about humans engaging in awful, wicked behaviour, we need to think about what makes it awful and wicked. And I'm going to suggest that pagans think significantly different on these issues to Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, Jains, Sikhs, Christians, whatever. I think probably most people around the world would come to similar conclusions about most of these issues. Maybe the odd one or two where there are different points of view, but by and large, most of the same approaches will be encountered all around the world. So we might think about, is it something integral to the behaviour in and of itself? So is there something innate to torturing people, or to robbing houses or shops, or whatever type of building it might be? Is there something in and of itself integral to certain forms of behaviour that make those behaviours unacceptable, that make them wicked, that make them awful? Or is it less the action than it is the state of mind behind the action, given that people could do the same things for somewhat different reasons? So a fairly obvious example might be stealing. So if you've got two people who steal, and one of them is desperately poor and is stealing food to feed to their starving children, and another person is very well off but is stealing for the fun of stealing because they're bored and it's an excitement, there's a bit of a buzz, to go out and steal stuff they could easily afford to buy, is one form of behaviour worse than the other? The behaviour itself is basically the same, but the mental drive behind it is different. So is it the mental drive, the state of mind, that makes a behaviour unacceptable? Or if we're staggering these things in a pyramid of levels of awfulness, is it the state of mind that raises a behaviour up or pushes it down, the pyramid of awfulness? Is part of that state of mind a reflection of culpability? Using the term intellectual culpability here, but you could understand culpability in ways unrelated to intellect. But what I'm essentially trying to get at is the level of moral responsibility a reflection of someone's capacities. So if a person who is very limited in their capacities, doesn't really understand much of anything, engages in an act of violence, is that better or worse or exactly the same as someone who is very intellectually developed, very aware of their own behaviour, very well informed, engaging in exactly the same behaviour? Do we hold the more capable to a greater level of culpability than the very limited? In much the same way you might say a behaviour engaged in by a 5-year-old is probably not as bad as the same kind of behaviour engaged in by a 20-year-old whom you would assume would know a great deal better and have a great deal more self-control and personal responsibility than the 5-year-old. Usually, at any rate. Finally, we might question whether the target of the action is a key factor. Because there are cultures around the world where what you do is less important than who you do it to. So, for example, fiddling money off a stranger might be okay, but fleecing one of your own relatives of money would be absolutely awful and seen as just too wicked for words. So although the behaviour is the same, the fact that you owe a duty of loyalty to one person and you have violated that duty of loyalty, that is what makes the behaviour unacceptable, far more so than doing the same behaviour against a person to whom you owe no particular vote of loyalty. So as per the suggestions on the screen, is it worse to torture a human being than it is to torture a dog or a horse or whatever kind of creature it might be? Is it worse to molest someone who's very young than someone who is middle-aged? Or is it the case that The behaviour is the behaviour, no matter who it's directed at, and that is what makes it unacceptable, the behaviour in and of itself, rather than the identity of the target against whom it's directed. I'm not going to offer you answers to any of these questions from a pagan point of view, because I'm assuming most of the people listening to this probably are pagan themselves. And you might be weighing up these relative concepts in your own mind and thinking how your particular tradition deals with, addresses these notions. If you're not a pagan, then what you'll tend to find is individual pagans have their own stance. So there isn't an official view that all Druids have, or all heathens have, or all Wiccans have. Rather, you'll find there are certain ways of thinking about these issues which might be more common amongst heathens or more common amongst Wiccans, but are not per se required, enforced that you have to think in a certain way if you subscribe to a particular line of thinking or particular point of view. I've already mentioned that things chop and change over time, that what was considered wicked amongst the Puritans in the American colonies, if you've ever read The Scarlet Letter or watched one of the film versions of it, what was considered wicked then, having a child out of wedlock, in other parts of the world, in other periods of history, no one would bat an eyelid at, would seem irrelevant. All of those things have gone in and out of understanding in different societies what's acceptable, what's unacceptable. There's a lot of areas which can chop and change quite significantly from one point in time to another, or from one part of the world to another part of the world. So this isn't to wholly go down the argument of moral relativity as being absolutely correct, but rather just to say that whatever your understanding of morality, it has to factor in that different periods of history, different cultures and so forth change. And that's particularly so for pagans who are, particularly those types of pagans who are tracking their religious practices back to a specific period of history and a specific culture. So some brands of paganism are quite sort of open, quite general, integrate ideas from all over the world and from different periods of history. A little bit of this, a bit of that. Other branches of paganism are very much centred in certain cultures and certain periods of history, even where they're being practised maybe in a different part of the planet and obviously in a different century. So do you attempt, let's say you are rooting your values and your ideas and your spiritual practices back to 1st century Ireland, for argument's sake, but you now live in 21st century Australia. So should you try to live by your moral code as if it was still 1st century Ireland, or does your moral code have to open up to, adapt to, integrate the changes that take place from living in Australia in the 21st century? Or perhaps be a blend of two, an element of the ancient and an element of the modern. Legally, if you try to engage in some of the same things, practices, cultural traditions that were to be found in 1st century Ireland, whilst living in 21st century Australia, you might well find yourself in the court. So just for your own kind of legal safety, you might have to make some degree of adaptation. But is that degree of adaptation a willing one, or more of a gritted teeth necessity of adapting to the modern world? Depends on the situation you're in. Having mentioned the idea of soul strengthening, we'll just briefly touch on Elvin Plantinga, who is another Christian theologian, but whose arguments can apply across the board, not just within Christianity. Plantinga advanced the free will defence, which is the argument made that humans are given free will, and perhaps many other creatures too, many other species maybe are also given free will. What does free will mean if you are not capable of doing awful things? To have free will surely means you've got to be capable of both. You've got to have a capacity to be both good and bad, moral and immoral, honourable and dishonourable, in the hope that you will choose the honourable path, the good path. But if you are prevented from choosing the dishonourable path or the wicked path, then are you reduced in effect to the level of a robot, a machine that can only act on a pre-programmed pattern of behaviour? True free will means you must have the capacity to do dreadful things. If you have the capacity to do dreadful things, but choose not to, but choose to do good things, then that goodness becomes all the sweeter. The honourable path becomes all the more honourable because you chose it, as opposed to being forced into it, being pressured into it. If you only do a good deed because somebody else has made you, forced you, put a gun to your head, hypnotised you, made you do it, programmed you like a robot and obliged you to do it, are you truly good? If you're just trundling along under the pressure of somebody else's willpower. So for Plantinga, wickedness is critical in giving us free will, and therefore a level of decency when we do choose to do that which is good. You could make the same argument from a pagan point of view, that we have, most pagan traditions argue that humans have free will, and that therefore part and parcel of free will is the capacity to do dreadful things. The capacity to do dreadful things, you could argue, has got to be contingent on the wish to do dreadful things. So if someone was incapable of experiencing greed, then they could never hoard everything to themselves. So let's take as an example, in a lot of Northern European myth, particularly Norse Germanic Scandinavian stories, avarice, hoarding money, is seen as a particularly bad thing to do. And the image of the dragon sleeping on top their mountain of gold is a kind of an emblem of greedy, avaricious kings and queens who hoard their wealth to themselves and never share it out with their people. That's seen as a particularly crappy, dishonourable sort of thing to do. If you had an individual who was never capable of experiencing that kind of avarice, that kind of greed, then it would never even occur to them in the first place to hoard their money. So the fact that person does not hoard their money is perhaps not really an expression of their honourable character, because they were never capable of thinking in a certain way in the first place. It's only honourable if you are capable of greed, but choose not to indulge it. So you get the urge every now and then to hoard things, but you think, nope, that's a shoddy path to go down. I know it's wrong. I'm not going to give in to that impulse. I am going to share my wealth with my people, with my tribe. Then you are honourable, because you had the impulse, but you resisted it. The person who never has the impulse in the first place, are they so honourable? It's very easy not to do a thing you don't particularly want to do in the first place. Like, I could brag about never having smoked, because I have no wish to smoke. I don't like the smell of cigarettes. Well, there is one brand of cigarette I do like the smell of, but by and large, most cigarettes I don't like the smell of them, so I get no urge to do it in the first place. So if it were just as Buddhists and Muslims and Christians and so on sometimes give things up for a period of time, they'll go on a fast or kind of giving things up for Lent, to that type of act of self-control. If, as part of a pagan ritual, everyone was saying, well, I'm going to give this up, I'm going to give that up, as an act of dedication to the gods, and I were to turn around and say, well, I'm not going to smoke for 6 months, it wouldn't really mean anything because I don't smoke anyway. It's not like I'm struggling to overcome some urge. I'm not learning self-control because in that particular instance I don't have the appetite there to control. So it's not such an honourable thing. If I were to say I'm going to give up eating fudge for 6 months, that would be quite an effort, because that is something I do have an appetite for, or weakness for, and so it would necessitate a degree of self-control on my part, and memory, to recollect my vow and not give in to my appetites for that period of time. So again, in that sense, we can say, well, why do people have grim urges to do awful things? You could argue that it is part and parcel of a deeply rooted a test. So, why do we have those drives? Well, we have them perhaps to test our capacity to overcome them, to test our capacity to be honourable, to put those appetites in their place. You could also equally argue there be some kind of evolutionary angle that there are certain drives and urges which, in moderation, are actually quite useful. So for our distant ancestors, I know today, 21st century Britain, there's plenty of food on the table, at least there is for me, hence the size of me. But maybe 1,000 years ago there would not have been for my great ancestors that were alive 1,000 years ago. And so when they could get food, if they had the binge appetite to hold a lot of it and scoff a lot of it, that would have helped their survival. So some drives in small doses are good for survival. It's only when they get out of place, they get over large, over magnified, that they can become problematic, or that those urges go on and on and on beyond the point where they're useful, and then they start to become destructive. So that which is wicked in one context, in a different context, might not be wicked. So perhaps from a pagan point of view, it's less that things are always wicked, always, put it in a Christian context, always sinful. Only that under certain circumstances they are wrong, inappropriate, lead down a very destructive path. But under other circumstances, the right kind of circumstances, in moderation, which is a very ancient Greek approach, all things in moderation, they could be turned to a positive advantage. So why are they there in the first place? Well, maybe they were there because they had a positive role to play in moderation. It's just that they've become out of moderation, they've become immoderate, over the top, in the wrong place, and that's when they become destructive. There are various arguments made in different traditions about where wickedness comes into the world, and some of those arguments are more detailed than others. Which ones are right, which ones are wrong? Well, all of them to some extent I think you can take as metaphorical anyway, and open to interpretation. So ideas of one being right and the other being wrong may be not terribly relevant, in the sense that one you could interpret one way and one maybe you can interpret other ways, and there is a question of interpretation rather than objective truth, concrete truth to these ideas. So a very well known story is the Greek account of Pandora's jar, although in one version it's actually Epimetheus, her husband, who opens the jar and not Pandora. But whether it's Pandora or Epimetheus or somebody else entirely, the idea that a jar containing lots and lots of awful forms of wickedness and suffering is presented to humanity with explicit instructions to keep the lid on, never open the jar. And then it's human curiosity that leads the person, be it Pandora, Epimetheus or somebody else, to take the lid off, and as soon as the lid is off, all of the sufferings leap out the jar and are running rampant around the world. And so as an account of why their sufferings and awfulness is in the world, while at one level you can take it that those wicked things were created by the gods, in this case of the Greek story, the jar is presented by Zeus, but it's presented as a test of self-control, and it's the human lack of self-control, that somewhat childish thing that as soon as you tell someone, particularly a child, but also some adults, as soon as you tell them not to do a thing, you can almost guarantee they'll rush out and do it in the very next instance. Very reminiscent, you might well say, of the whole Adam and Eve and the story of the fruit on the tree of knowledge of good and evil. As soon as someone is told don't do that, it's only a matter of time before they go and do it. So is it human curiosity or human lack of self-control that has brought suffering, both natural suffering and moral suffering, into the world? That had our distant ancestors had better self-control, the world would have been a different place, perhaps. Do we understand such a story to mean this is a kind of a historical story, that at a point in time this happened, and therefore all human beings have suffered as a result ever since? Or do we take it this is more a tale of a metaphor for each individual life, that in each individual person's life there will come a moment when they are faced with a jar, so to speak, that contains things, and do they have the self-control to leave it well alone, or will they succumb to temptation and do something that has repercussions for them for the remainder of their life because they wouldn't leave well enough alone in the first place? Well, that, again, say it's interpretation, it's down to you how you want to take that story. But the idea that a lot of miseries in life, and amongst the creatures that fly out of the jar are the Nazoi, who are embodiments of viruses and germs and diseases. So it is both the kind of natural sufferings as well as sadism and spite and nastiness and general human shittiness that emerge from the jar. It's as a result of human choice rather than something that pre-existed humanity. Per se, that's not going to be true, obviously, because before humanity evolved, the other species on the earth were subject to disease, were subject to pain and suffering. Whether they had moral capacity for wickedness, I have no idea, but they certainly had the capacity for pain and suffering caused by disease, caused by earthquakes and floods and famines and one thing and another. So suffering pre-existed humanity. But perhaps this is a metaphor for humans' capacity to make a bad situation 20 times worse by their own willfulness, their own need to dig and delve and explore, perhaps. There is an ancient Egyptian story told of Apep or Apapi, the great serpent of the world who causes untold misery and suffering and awfulness in the world. So a being that embodies awfulness. Now, is Apepi like the ancient Egyptian version of the devil in Christianity? Perhaps, to some extent at least. He's an embodiment of awfulness and so forth. But he can also be understood in other contexts, which we don't really have time to go into, but he could be understood in other ways. So he's not strictly speaking just a kind of a pagan Satan figure, but he does have a very grim role to play in myth. Where does he come from? Well, there is a story. How widely held this story was is open to debate. Was it confined to one region of Egypt, or was it to be found all over regions of Egypt? But that's somewhat uncertain. But a story that when Ra was born into the universe, the great king of the gods, the falcon-headed pharaoh, his umbilical cord was severed, as happens with obviously all children born, well, mammalian children born at any rate, and cast away. And that umbilical cord cast out into the darkness sprang into its own form of life and became Apep. There's a visual similarity between an umbilical cord and a snake-like shape, a serpentine shape. But again, how do we understand this at a more metaphorical level? Well, to some extent, this is, I think, echoed a very long time later in Kabbalistic stories to be found in Judaism. Whether there is a link between the two, well, it's a vague possibility, but maybe it is more in the line of re-echoing a common human experience in the language of different peoples. But in the Kabbalistic tradition, the tree of life is mirrored by the tree of death, the klipoth, and the tree of darkness. And the tree of darkness, the tree of death, is created as a natural process in the realm of creation itself, that when the tree of life, the Kabbalah, came into existence, at each juncture there was a sort of runoff, you might call it, much like smelting metal creates a certain degree of slag, which incidentally is where that term comes from as an insult, you slag, is to call somebody a pile of waste, a runoff detritus. So you purify metal, you get a bit of detritus. It's just part and parcel of the process of creating the sword or the axe head or whatever the bit of metal is going to be turned into. And so there is this same idea that as each sephira on the Tree of Life was created, each wheel on the Tree of Life was created, part of the creation process involved a detritus, a runoff waste product that created the anti-wheel or the anti-sphere, the anti-sephira on the Tree of Death. And so part of creation is the product of suffering and wickedness, as well as the product of goodness and joy and hope and all those lovely things in life. And so from a very Kabbalistic point of view, Yahweh, God, whatever term you want to use, Adonai, is as much a god of suffering as a god of goodness, is a god of both light and dark, of good and bad, a god who contains both capacities in and of himself, rather than being exclusively one thing, is both things. And in a sense, he say Ra, the goodness, the light, the brilliance, the radiance, as he cuts off the umbilical cord in his birthing, part of his coming into existence is the creation of a shadow, is the creation of detritus, of runoff, of the less useful, is the creation of Apep, the great serpent, this umbilical cut-off point that only becomes a source of malice when it is severed from the whole being. So whilst it was still attached to him, it was not wicked. It only became wicked when it was cut off from him. So when the light and the dark become separated, the dark becomes destructive. When they're integrated, it's a different picture, which itself is, you could argue, a good moral lesson and maybe a root understanding for the ancient mind, well, in this case the ancient Egyptian mind at any rate, as to the nature of relationship between honourable and dishonourable, between good and bad, between, to put it in Egyptian terms, ma'at, that which is orderly and harmonious and proper and beautiful, and izvet, that which is chaotic and discordant and displaced and upheaved and wrong. And that is an integral notion there, just to what we were saying a little bit earlier, about things being useful in certain contexts as survival drives, but becoming destructive when they are out of place. Izvet is something in the wrong place. So put that in a modern day context. Australia has a massive problem with cane toads, which were introduced to Australia very, very late in terms of recent history, late in the Australian history, and they eat just about every thing in sight and cause no end of misery to the native wildlife of Australia. When cane toads were in their own proper ecological niche on the other side of the planet, they weren't a problem. They only became a problem when they were put in the wrong place. There's an issue with cats in one of the islands. I'm going to say New Zealand, but I'm probably getting the wrong island there. It may be one of the other islands. But basically cats were introduced to a small island and ate virtually everything in sight, because the native species they'd never encountered a cat before, they didn't know how to avoid cats, or even understand that cats were a risk, and so they were easy prey. Cats in their own native environment were not an issue. It's when they're out of place, put into the wrong sort of environment, they become a threat, they become a problem, they become a source of upheaval and disaster. To a lot of extent, you could argue the Egyptian view, and I would suggest the view of a number of other ancient pagan cultures is quite similar, in that in a phenomena in one location, in one place, can be perfectly okay. That same phenomena taken out of place, put in the wrong location, becomes destructive, becomes a nightmare. It becomes wicked, for lack of a better word. It ceases to be a benevolent presence. And so whether something is good or bad depends as much on context. Where is it? What impact will it have according to where it is, as anything innate to the force in and of itself. Anything which is unbalanced without restraint becomes problematic. When it's in its proper environment, where it is balanced against and has restraints upon it, it's fine, it's good. So rather than making arguments that certain things, a moral absolutist argument, that certain things are always wicked, always terrible, always awful, it's more saying that under certain circumstances, with appropriate restraints, etc., in its natural habitat, we can put it like that, that behaviour, that way of thinking, that way of looking at the world would be fine. It's when it's taken out of its habitat, put into a different context, with no checks and balances upon it, that it becomes a source of mayhem and destruction and awfulness. The Vamori are the underwater monsters of Irish mythology, and in some respects may form a similar function in Irish mythology to the giants, the Jotuns in Scandinavian Germanic heathen mythology. The Vamori's proper location is under the sea. They're sea monsters. When they go onto land, that's when they become tyrants and bullies and thugs and engage in horrendous behaviour and have to be overthrown by the might of the gods. And if you like, put into their place. Prior to that, they were okay. And maybe the same could be argued of the fire giants and the ice giants in Norse mythology, that when they're in their place, in their fiery environments or their icy environments, they're fine where they are. It's when they get a bit out their pram and want to go somewhere else and intrude upon Asgard or intrude upon the Middle Realms or intrude in one of the other regions of the Nine Worlds where they don't belong, that's when they become a nightmare. That's when they cause mayhem and discord and chaos. And again, we can perhaps understand a lot of things as being okay when they're in the right situation, but a nightmare when they're in the wrong situation. There might have been a story in ancient times in Ireland and amongst others of the Celtic peoples as to quite where the Vamori came from, or comparable creatures to be found maybe in the mythology of Gaul or the mythology of the Brythonic tribes and so on. Where did their monstrous creatures emerge from? Because whatever the origin story of the Vamori is, it's been lost in the passage of time. So we just have accounts of the Vamori being there. Quite how they got there is not accounted for in the surviving stories. I dare say there probably was a story at some point as to how they got there, but it's been lost to the passage of time. So we'll skip on from there. There are various different approaches and ideas which we can understand, just a few smattering of quotes and so on to go through. As I said earlier, there's so many different views, so many philosophers, it's impossible to go over them all. So this is just a small sampling. So Aristotle, giving an opinion that many Greeks, I suspect, would have shared in the ancient world, that it is our choice of good or evil that determines our character, not our opinion about good or evil. So partly just having an opinion, spouting hot air, lots and lots of words, doesn't make a damn bit of choice. You can talk till you're blue in the face. It's what you do is more important than what you incessantly talk about. So we can think of politicians and religious leaders and celebrities and all sorts of people who talk and talk and talk and talk and are forever bloody saying things, but whose behaviour is at odds with their speech. And it's the behaviour that is the critical thing. What do you actually do? What choices do you make in life shape your character? And underpinning this is Aristotle's idea that character is essentially formed by choices. It's not innate. You're not born definitely good or definitely bad or definitely this or definitely that. You become what you become as a result of the patterns of choices you make over time. And as you achieve a degree of self-awareness, then you can look back on your life and understand the good choices you've made and the bad choices you've made, and alter. You can become a better person. So that the brave person is brave because they've made a series of choices over a period of time that were brave things to do. They have become brave as a matter of habit by constantly making brave choices. Equally, the coward has become a coward because they've constantly made cowardly choices. At any point in time, that could be turned around by learning to make better choices. So, for Aristotle, free will is integral. The wicked person can stop being wicked. Equally, you could argue the good person could stop being good. Anyone can choose to change their approach to life because we have capacity of control, self-control in the decisions we make. We may have the urges, going back to that argument, you may be quite a person with a strong avaricious streak, a love of money. You might be a very kind of lusty person who's always fancying a good shag with everyone you come across. You might be also have all sorts of urges, but that doesn't mean you've got to act on them constantly all the time. You can learn to control your urges rather than perpetually give way to them in inappropriate contexts. And so it's your choices that determine whether you are an honourable person or whether you are a sleazebag. Not the urges you have, but the choices you make. The quote there from one of the old Egyptian coffin texts, those who destroy the lie promote ma'at. So the lie in this case is izvet. So by countering dishonesty, you promote goodness, you promote orderliness, you promote harmony, you promote ma'at. Those who promote the good will erase the evil. Again, do that which is good and it tackles that which is wrong. As fullness casts out appetite, as clothes cover the nude, as heaven clears up after a storm. So goodness can overcome wickedness. When you are confronted by bad things, you can overcome them. You can put them in their place. You can promote that which is good in yourself by cultivating good behaviour. Again, quite like Aristotle's ideas just there, that by cultivating a certain approach to life, you shape your own character, you form yourself, you create consistent patterns that are easy to follow, and you uphold both the good in yourself and, because ma'at is simultaneously within you and outside you, not only do you improve the ma'at within you, but you have a kind of a domino effect, a ripple effect on the world around you, and you promote goodness outside yourself. Just as conversely, if you were always giving in to izvet, you would not only promote it in yourself, but you would promote izvet in the world around you. So again, it's within self-control. It's within our own ability to choose who we become, what we do, how we do it. The quote from the Havamar there, one of the heathen books of wisdom, the Havamar is attributed to Odin as having, whether he actually said it first or not, I suppose is a moot point, but it's attributed to something he said and was then written down. Where you recognise evil, speak out against it and give your enemies no peace. So seeing dishonour, seeing shamefulness, seeing poor behaviour and speaking out against it, that's an idea we'll come back to momentarily. We may look at some ideas from within Druidry, that it is important to speak out, not merely stay silent for the sake of a peaceful life, to stand up against awfulness rather than to be silent against it, and to not give up the fight even if at times you might wish you could have a holiday from it, but to return to trying to do good in the world even on those days where it feels like you're in a losing battle and that the forces of corruption and wickedness are much too strong around you. Nonetheless, do not give up. Persist. Keep going. So speaking of ethical codes, there are a number from different sources, different types of pagan tradition. We won't go over all of them because we'll go mad and die. But just to give you a flavour of some, hopefully you'll be familiar with all of these, but just in case there's any you're not. For Wiccans, both initiated Wiccans and those who follow a type of paganism which is inspired by Wicca, even if it doesn't go down the full initiatory route, the Wiccan Rede is a commonly adhered to phenomena, and a lot of pagans who would not necessarily call themselves Wiccan might nonetheless go with the bottom two sentences on the left-hand side. The slightly fuller version is 8 words that we can read, fulfill, and it harm none, do as you will, which is nice and short and simple, intentionally so. The first person known to have put this idea out there into the public was Doreen Valiente, and she gives her own account of where the ideas came from, which you can go and look up. Essentially, Doreen Valiente and Joe Gardner were looking for a straightforward moral code that would inspire people without having a big long list of thou shalt not do this and thou must do that, and being all very censorious. They wanted something neat and tight and easily encapsulated. And so the 8 words, and it harm none, do as you will, seems to go with that. Has pre-existed Valiente and Gardner as a philosophical idea that's been promoted by a number of different people over the centuries, that as long as you're not hurting anyone, just get on with your life, do what you want, so long as you're not maiming anyone in the process. It's not quite as simplistic as it sounds, in that there are areas for debate and discussion. I'll suggest a couple and leave you to mull over them, if you haven't already done so at some point in your life already. What constitutes harm, for example? So at one level there are fairly obvious forms of harm. Smashing someone in the face is fairly harmful. Kicking them down stairs is fairly harmful. That's pretty obvious. However, there are greyer areas. Is necking an entire bottle of scotch harmful? Well, it won't do your liver much good. Is chain smoking harmful? Well, it's going to do your lungs a lot of good, not to mention other parts of your anatomy. And secondary smoke may cause harm to other people too. So quite what do we constitute harm here? Now, there are some forms of experience that are very unpleasant and harmful to a degree, but necessary for the greater good. So a visit to the dentist to have rotting teeth pulled out, or going under the surgeon's scalpel, would involve, obviously heart is painful, and under the scalpel your body is being harmed in the sense of sliced open and so on. But clearly we go along with this voluntarily because those short-term pains and harms will prevent much worse problems later on. And so it produces a greater good than the initial unpleasantness of the medical procedure. So by and large we wouldn't call it harm on the whole. We would say it's a good thing even if there is an initial step which is painful or harmful. That's not really what's being meant here, so there needs to be a clarification of harm. The none part needs clarifying, harm none. Does that include yourself? So back to heavy drinking, heavy smoking, snorting, cocaine, doing whatever. Is that causing harm? Well, a lot of it is going to cause some kind of medical, biological harm to the person doing it. But is that, when it says harm none, does it explicitly only mean other people? Or does it include not harming yourself? And when it includes other people, is that only other human people? So would it include not harming small furry animals or large scaly animals? If it extends to the non-human, does that mean you have to be a vegetarian? Because obviously wringing a chicken's neck in order to eat it is harmful for the chicken. I suppose you could wait for the chicken to die of old age and then eat it, but would greatly reduce the omnivorous diet if you had to wait for animals to die off naturally before you could eat them. Could be done, of course, could be done. Does it extend to harm of other beings? going back to what we were saying last week about a realm of possible other entities in existence aside from flesh and blood creatures that we see around us. Could they be harmed? If so, how? If so, how do you avoid it? The do what ye will bit kind of depends on whether you see the will in the sense of do whatever you feel like, and more like kind of a whim, or whether you think that word will should have a capital W and referred to the will of your higher self. Is this about acting in accord with your spiritual calling, or is it just doing whatever the hell you feel like doing at a given moment in time? Because those involve rather different sets of actions. So it's not quite as simplistic and clear-cut. There is room for discussion and room for interpretation for the Wiccan read. But generally speaking, it's trying to come up with a live a good life, don't maim people, just get on with it. Don't have too many rules, too many obsessions, just as long as you enjoy your life. If you want to walk around in a bunny suit, that's fine, as long as you're not harming anyone. If you want to smoke and drink and eat chocolate and drive cars and do this and do that, as long as you're not harming people, get on and do it. But it's the clarification of quite what constitutes harm that's challenging. On the right hand side of the screen you have some virtue ethics from ancient Rome. The Greeks were also great believers in virtue ethics, although obviously they used Greek terms rather than Latin terms to describe those ethics. The four on the screen are just a random four. There's loads of ethics that are mentioned by Roman writers, and at the Temple of Delphi in ancient Greece there were various virtues extolled in the carvings around the walls. A lot of the walls have crumbled away to nothing, and so we don't know what they all were originally, but some have survived, and those maxims and truths and ideals being encouraged, like respect for the elderly, for example, is one that leaps to mind. But prudentia is prudence, being restrained and wise and sensible. Justitia, justice, to be fair, to be just in your dealings with other people. Temperantia, to be temperate, moderate, calm. Fortitudo, to be to have fortitude, to keep struggling on. Or as Winston Churchill says, at least the Doctor Who version of Winston Churchill says, keep buggering on and don't give up when the struggle gets hard. Forge ahead, keep your sense of endurance in life, you'll need it. A key idea, going back to what we've already said a moment ago on the other screen about Aristotle, underpinning the notion of virtue ethics, both Roman and Greek, is that these are the products of habit. You're not born with an enormous amount of temperance or fortitude or justice. These are things you learn to do, attitudes you cultivate and express through action. And you'll be faced with 101 situations in life in which you can either express the virtues, or you can be weak and fail to express them and succumb to vice. And really it's a pattern of consistent behaviour formed over time. So someone we might refer to as being generally quite compassionate may not be compassionate 1,000 times out of 1,000 incidences. Maybe they manage 950 or 980, but by and large they are mostly compassionate. It goes along with a famous maxim about not judging things, call no man happy till he is dead. In other words, it's best not to judge things except when they're over and done with and you're looking back to say, was this person mostly a happy person? Was this institution mostly a fair institution? Was it mainly this, mainly that, mainly the other? And you never quite know until it's over and done with. Because whilst something is in the middle of its existence, it still has the capacity to go in different directions. It's only when it's ceased to have the capacity to go in different directions that you can look back and say that was mostly a good life or mostly a bad life, mostly this, mostly that. So it's again back to the idea that we are constantly faced with choices and we must make the right choice in the situations before us. That is what will make us a decent person. For the Egyptians, the dead soul arrives in the afterlife, the newly dead, and is faced in the halls of Amenti with a panel of 42 assessors. And each one of these assessors poses a challenge to the recently dead soul and says, have you done this particular wicked thing? And the soul must say either yes I have or no I haven't. And on the whole, the soul is weighed up after the 42 assessors have each had their question. And the kind of balance of good deeds versus wicked deeds is weighed up. If your wicked deeds outweigh your good deeds, then your heart is thrown to the monster on the right-hand side of the screen, Amanet, who eats your heart. And either, depending on quite how you interpret the text, either you blink out of existence entirely, or you reincarnate and have another crack at trying to get it right. Or if your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, then you pass on to the fields of Aru, or A'alu, depending on how you want to pronounce it, which is a sort of blissful paradise-like state. But the 42 declarations of innocence are a guide to the sorts of moral virtues that the Egyptians lived by, which were quite similar to the ones that Aristotle was advocating. It does include some quite specific things like not stealing food from the temples, food that's meant for the gods or food that's meant for the ancestors, but also includes general principles of honesty and moral probity, and not harming and mutilating people left, right and centre. So some quite similar ideas. But again, moral judgments being made when your capacity for judgment is at an end, rather than when you're in the middle of life and still faced with who knows how many choices ahead of you. The 9 noble virtues are arguments put forward in modern day heathenry, not ancient heathenry, based upon different people's readings of the older myths and what they feel are the commonest virtues and behaviours extolled in the ancient myths. So Stephen McNally put forward these 9 concepts. There are variations of this put forward by other people who don't all agree on the same 9. Some of them will go for slightly different takes. But again, the idea of a little bit like Aristotle, a set of virtues, a set of principles to aspire to, but favouring here a set of 9 rather than the rather unlimited set that Aristotle talked about, which that Aristotle wasn't describing a fixed number. It was much more open-ended. 9 perhaps because of the 9 worlds of Norse myth, and so 9 is a sort of popular number to put things in sets of. Courage, strength, joy, freedom, strong kinship groups and so on, these virtues and ideas, again, which are choices to be faced. How do I live my life? But also, you could argue, choices about how you allow or interfere or support with other people's lives. So freedom is better than slavery for me as an individual, but equally that would mean perhaps encourage me not to go around and enslave anyone else, because otherwise I'm robbing them of their freedom and denying them the chance to live by the virtue of freedom. So not only do I refuse to be a slave to somebody else, but I ought to refuse to enslave anyone else myself. So it's both what I will want in my life, but also what I will seek to provide to other people in their lives. And should I, by extension, if I witness someone being enslaved by a third party, should I try my best to help them escape that slavery, or challenge the person doing the enslaving? Maybe so. Depends how you interpret these things as to how you feel they ought to be put into the world. And if joy is better than guilt, I can seek joy in my own life, but I can also seek to share joy with other people, to try and bring happiness to their lives as well as happiness to my own, and help them to enjoy themselves without feeling guilty and weighed down by the baggage of guilt. So it's striving to live by these virtues. To some extent, these are the kind of virtues that Nietzsche was very inspired by as well. Took a lot of his lead, as it were, from the hero myths of Greece and Rome the Scandinavian stories, the Germanic stories, as embodying strength and independence and fortitude, and people who are taking life by the horns, living their own choices and paying the cost for their choices, not passing them back on to anyone else. But chiefly, I suppose, the driving bedrock at the bottom of all that is trying to be as independent as you can be, and not expecting other people to carry you if it is possible for you to carry yourself. And there's going to be occasions when you're an infant, when you're very, very frail, maybe occasions in your life when you're very unwell for a period of time. There's going to be occasions in anyone's life when they need the help and support of others because they temporarily or permanently lose the ability to support themselves. But the strive for those ancient peoples, at least as Nietzsche understood it and viewed it, is that they aspired to be as self-contained as they could manage to be, and to look after their immediate nearest and dearest, but look after them in the sense of not only providing for them in the short term, but encouraging them towards independence in the long term. There's individual ones of these you could talk about for hours, and I'm sure there must be books and podcasts by other people that do exactly that. Druid moral codes are very unclear because we have so little written by Druid, well, absolutely nothing written by the Druids themselves as a priestly caste. We've got scraps written about them, claims made about them by other people. Some of those claims may be quite accurate, and some of them may be pure fantasy, made a long time after the Druids had ceased to be a vital presence in the world. But there's a particular quote which I like, and I'm presenting it purely as a kind of self-interest thing. I'm not arguing that other Druids of the modern world would go along with this necessarily, but in early Irish myth we have the stories of the Fína, the warrior band led by Finn McCall. If you're unfamiliar with them at all, if you kind of imagine something that's a sort of a mash-up between Robin Hood and the Merry Men and the A-Team, then the Fína are these sort of warriors, very, very skilled, very magical warriors, all sorts of weird and wonderful powers, who during the summer months live in the woods and up the mountains and in the wilds of Ireland. And any time that pirates or brigands or monsters or general baddies turn up, then the tribes send for the Fína. They send for the goodies, for the A-Team, if you like, to come and protect them from the rotten buggers that are oppressing them. And in exchange, during the winter months, when it's no longer very nice living in the woods, the Fína come and live at home with their families and friends and whatnot, and shelter under a roof for the winter months before going back to their life of daring and doom. And they are said to have a moral code, the Shushanjas, this moral set of 3 precepts to live by, which translated into English is truth in our hearts, strength in our hands, and fulfilment on our lips. Or sometimes it's translated as tongues rather than lips, but much of a muchness. So truth in our hearts is to know the truth in yourself. Whether you share that with other people is a secondary choice. But do not lie to yourself, do not kid yourself, do not delude yourself. See yourself and your life and your choices and your situations for what they are. Strength in our hands is about having courage to face life's challenges, not to run away screaming and hide under the bed and be adrift, but to, when you are afraid, to face your fears. So no matter how much your knees knock, that you nonetheless manage to stand up straight on the battlefield of life and face whatever is coming at you. Whether that's a psychopath with an axe, or whether it's illness, or the chaos and tragedies and upheavals of life, whatever it is, you face it with strength and you live life to the full. The third one I could wax lyrical about for a while, but I won't, because I've spoken long enough as it is. But fulfilment on our lips harks back to one of the earlier screens where we were looking at the heathen sentiment of from the Havamar of if you see evil, speak out against it, denounce it. Fulfilment on our lips is a virtue understood by the bards and the Fili of ancient, well, the bards of ancient Wales and Britain, the Fili of Ireland, the poets, etc., that if you see wickedness taking place, it is your moral duty to denounce it, speak out against it. Because by speaking out, whoever it is that's doing the bad thing will be called to account. They'll know that they've been spotted and seen for what they are. But also, very importantly, the young will hear your denouncement and they will know that that behaviour is dishonourable. If you don't speak out, they won't know. So it's about reinforcing values amongst the young, as well as holding the wicked to account. But equally, the flip side of this is that where you see good, you should also speak out to praise. So condemn what is bad and praise what is good. If you praise what is good, the person doing the good will know they've been seen, they've been appreciated, they've been valued. They've been given a slap on the back and told well done. And again, the young will hear what is honourable, will hear what is good, because if they don't hear it, they won't necessarily know it. And so when they aspire to be honourable themselves as they get older, their memories will revert back to what they have heard being praised when they were young. And they'll think, oh, I want to be an honourable person, I'll go and do what that person from 5 years ago did. And so the goodness replicates itself, as well as the wickedness being held to account. And we all know that time and again you can see incidences in the modern world of wicked people doing shitty things and no one says anything, so they get worse and they get worse and they get worse. And they seem to get away with blue murder. If no one says anything, silence becomes taken as tacit consent to what that individual is getting up to. So it's important to speak out. So as a moral code, and this is the kind of code that I personally strive to live by. I'm not saying I do a particularly good job of it, but I strive to live by it, and as do the other members of the group I belong to, and many other druids, not all necessarily all druids, because different druids have a different take on morality, but it's an aspirational concept to live by, as understandings of what is good and what is bad, and again pinned into this idea through the strength of our hands that it is our choices that define us. What we do in a given situation, not what we flap our gums about, because even though just as having said just now about fulfilment on our lips, if all you got is talk and no follow through, then you're just a windbag. So it's got to be a combination of talk and follow through. Action, deed. Not you're born bad, not you're born good, but you are made good or you're made bad, you're made honourable or made dishonourable by your deeds, by your choices. And I think that as an approach is quite consistent in a lot of ancient pagan philosophies from around different parts of the world, to focus on what people do as being quite critical rather than just what they say or notions that they're born one way or another. So someone who has had a bad past can redeem themselves and become better in the future. But equally, someone who's had a good past could fall off their perch and slip into bad ways if they start making sloppy decisions. So it's something we create ongoingly in the moment, our goodness or our badness. Now, if you've enjoyed listening to this, or even if you haven't perhaps, but you've listened to it nonetheless, the price, the cost, the quid pro quo, the reciprocity that I've requested in previous ones, I'll just reiterate here. If you could make a donation to a food bank or some similar kind of a charity near to wherever it is that you live, whether you want to give actual food or you would prefer to put money towards them, whatever works best for you, but just spread the love. If you found these podcasts at all useful or interesting, or they've helped you think about these issues in ways you've not previously thought about, please do go and pass on your happiness by sharing some food with people who are struggling at the moment, which can include not just humans, that can include animal shelters that might need tins of dog food or cat food or whatever it is that they're after, to help feed their residents. If you do that, it will be much appreciated. If you have questions, you can post them on the page where I upload this podcast to. Thank you.